Thank you. Thank you all for having me. And sorry, I need to move this. I like showing that video because I think it helps in setting the stage for my own emotional context that is then going to, I believe, assist in helping you all understand this, something of, I guess, a bit of a journey that I've put myself on. And that is really centrally and highly focused around what I believe is truly lacking when it comes to journalism, when it comes to policy making, when it comes to how we're viewing the world and the way that we're moving things forward. And I believe that one of the big things that we do not understand, and that the failure to understand this is not going to permit us to break out of our current cycles of violence, our cycles of polarization, is emotional history. And so we call this talk, the need for empathy on the front lines. But when we talk about empathy, what is it that we are really trying to address? And when we talk about the front lines, are we just talking about certain front lines? No, we're not. We're talking about the front lines of war. Yes, front lines that are increasingly murky with no specific boundaries. We're talking about the front lines of politics and this gross polarization that we're seeing in the way that we're all just hardening into our positions. We're also talking about the front lines of our own humanity. Many people will argue, including myself, that we are perhaps in something of a battle for our greater humanity and what direction we're going to take as a collective species. And you might be asking yourself right now, there have been new studies into a field called epigenetics, which is basically how trauma is passed down through generations, and how we all are carrying the traumas of our parents, our grandparents, and our great-grandparents. And the way that trauma is passed down is not that it is necessarily sort of altering your DNA, but it alters the way that your DNA interacts with each other. What this means is that not a single person is born as a blank slate. None of us are born these sort of entirely wiped hard drives. We're born with certain instincts for actions and reactions. And as we grow from children into teenagers into adults, our perspectives are constantly being shaped by a number of different factors that are around us. What we need to recognize as journalists, especially, is what are those factors that have already shaped our perspectives, and then how do we overcome the impact that they're having on us so that we can become better journalists, to be able to create better stories that are going to drive a deeper and more profound understanding of conflicts and of people. I believe that one of our biggest failures is our inability to truly understand each other and what motivates us on an individual level, on a community level, on a societal level, on a national level. I remember when I first went into journalism, so I didn't study journalism, right? I have a biology degree, and I was in New York working for a Turkish textile company, which is basically me not knowing what I wanted to do after I graduated. My dad's American, my mom's Syrian. I grew up very bicultural. I speak, Arabic. Our breakfasts were always this mix of, za'atar and labneh and blueberry pancakes. So I'm in New York working for this Turkish textile company, which is also just a fancy way of saying I sold bathrobes and towels. And 9/11 happened. And like so, many, I remember exactly where I was that day. And I remember the way that people came together, especially in New York, the way strangers were offering, refuge for those who had to flee, the way that, there were lines and lines and lines for people waiting to donate blood. But then I feel as if it flipped very, very quickly. And the campaign began, the campaign of dehumanizing, the campaign of othering. And I remember being like, well, I don't get it, because how does one half of me otherize the other? And that's when I decided to start going into journalism, because I also have this very bizarre privilege, perhaps, in that I do not look Arab. And because I don't look Arab, I could speak to a Western audience and to, especially at that time, my American peers about some very sort of fundamental beliefs and perspectives that Arabs have and how they view things and what has actually led them to have those perspectives that they have. And that was my first sort of foray into wanting to be a journalist. And it's also what really led to me to realize and recognize one of a handful of very key factors that leads to our manipulation. We are constantly being manipulated, all of us, every single day, practically every single moment. Some would even argue right now that me just giving this speech, I am actually trying to manipulate your way of thinking. And that might be true. It's all about how we react to the manipulations and what we're able to draw from it. So if we look at these key factors when we're talking about a polarized world and what we can do as journalists in terms of our role to try to bring people together and educate it, we need to recognize that no country can go to war, no military can go to war without launching a dehumanization campaign. This happens every single time. It doesn't matter who or what. No military campaign can succeed without a dehumanization campaign, because no population will accept the level of death and destruction that is being caused unless they have been preconditioned to not look at those who are suffering as being the same as them. This is called psychological operations in military speak. In the political spaces, it's called propaganda. In the social media space, it's all of the disinformation that's out there. It's your bots, it's your this, it's your that. It's the 10,000 different voices that are coming at you and constantly bombarding you all the time. And so we need to do these exercises as journalists, and I do this all the time, where you try to look in and try to understand why you have a certain perspective on a certain issue. Why have you reacted in a certain way to a certain person and not to exactly the same person from a different conflict or from a different context? I remember when I was first reporting out of Iraq, so it was 2003, the US military obviously was well into its invasion at that time. I was still a very young punk, 20-something-year-old producer running around all over the place, still freelance at that point. And I remember very clearly seeing the US tanks and seeing the way that the military was just bashing down doors and the way that they were treating the Iraqi population, especially the Iraqi men. And it was like a gut punch, because I could see it, because I could see how these actions were going to result in an unsafer context. But the American soldiers didn't understand it. And I could also feel within myself this level of discomfort being around US troops. I automatically did not want to spend time with them. I didn't want to get to know them. But I was with them constantly. I was, on all these embeds, and then as Iraq got more and more dangerous, traveling with the US military became the only way that we could travel around the country. And it was particularly during the battle for Fallujah in 2004 that I sort of tried to flip my own thinking into, I need to get to know these people. I need to understand what it is that has motivated a young American to join the military, fly all the way across the world to another country. And Fallujah actually, ironically, provided me with the opportunity to do that, because we were embedded with this unit and I was producing, so I would have to send our stories over. And back then it wasn't like today. We traveled with these ginormous flaps that took forever to send a piece over. And so I would end up hanging out with the guys who had guard duty. And I would start to get to know them. And because I was starting to get to know them, they stopped being these like figures that I had assigned to them, but actually became so much more than that. They were thinkers. There was one young man in particular who was actually killed later. And I remember he looked at me and he said, Arwa, I'm struggling. I'm struggling because when I need to shoot the enemy, I'm always thinking that he believes in what he's fighting for as much as I believe in what I'm fighting for. And that he also has someone who loves him, who also, once I've pulled the trigger, is going to be absolutely devastated. Now, listening to these different perspectives and sort of trying to allow yourself to open your thinking to them does not necessarily mean that you agree with the person or with the perspective. I've also interviewed countless ISIS fighters behind bars, and their story roughly is always more or less the same. It centers around humiliation. It centers around feeling wronged. It centers around, loss. It centers around obviously being subjected to enormous amounts of brainwashing. I understand how they got to the point of decision of saying, I'm going to go and join this horrendous group, but I don't agree with it. But my understandings on all of these different levels enhanced my ability to report on all of these conflicts. And so you may be asking yourself, why are we talking about empathy then? Like, why did we call this talk the need for empathy on the front lines? Because without empathy, you cannot be open to other people's emotional history context or to their emotional journeys. And if we don't have that, especially for people who aren't necessarily directly part of our spheres, I believe we cannot genuinely do a story justice. And I believe that we cannot serve our purpose of trying to educate and to understand what is happening in the world around us. We need to be able to, first and foremost, though, understand ourselves before we can begin to understand the others who are around us. We need to look at ourselves right now, and I believe journalism has an even greater role today than it did before, if we're able to shift also into understanding and incorporating emotional histories into our reporting. And this isn't easy, but it's very important to recognize what makes you cringe and also what is going to make others cringe, and then how do you reach out in a way, and how do you present the story in a way that is going to allow them to at least open up a little bit. So when we hear things that are uncomfortable, and this goes back to epigenetics and the studies that have been done on it, when we go through, or when our ancestors and our parents and grandparents go through traumas, if that trauma is not properly addressed, it's not only altering the way that the next generation's DNA acts and reacts with each other, it also becomes very calcified and hardened. And a lot of us, especially right now, when we look at the way that the world has been polarized, we are finding ourselves in these situations where, if not necessarily in our role as journalists, then in our role as human beings, where when we hear something, and maybe you've recognized this with people around you or with your readers or viewers, there's a wall that comes up. We're in this position where when people hear something that makes them uncomfortable, that challenges their already existing notions, this wall comes straight down. And we need to figure out as journalists ways to penetrate that wall. And the reason why this wall comes down is that we are preconditioned. We will mentally try to save ourselves from hearing something that is going to make us uncomfortable and challenge our beliefs, and we turn inwards. We need to be hypersensitive as journalists, as people who are out there. And I actually don't see that big of a difference between what I do in the journalism space and what I do in the humanitarian space, because it's still all about storytelling and trying to build these bridges. But we need to be hypersensitive to what it is that we're saying and how we're saying it and to what audience we're saying it. And we cannot accomplish that and begin to bring down these walls that are a basic instinct if we do not have empathy and if we do not have an understanding of emotional context. The other thing that I think is very important for all of us to keep in mind is that when we're out and reporting, and whether, again, it's politics or war zones, it serves to give you a better interview when you're able to frame your questions and your own actions and reactions depending on who it is who you're talking to. People know and can read and sense if you already have discredited them in your mind, or if you're just getting the soundbite because you were told to go out and get the other perspective. And the only way to break through that and get a bit more of a genuine conversation is if you have managed to sort of break down your own reasons as to why you have that perspective towards something. And again, understanding does not mean agreement. And that's a very important thing to keep remembering over and over again. And whenever I find myself having to have a conversation or seeing something that makes me sort of curl up inwards because it's making me uncomfortable, I always try to do this exercise that I call why. And it's very ugly and it's very uncomfortable. But I kind of just sit there and I go, why? Why do I have less empathy for this child than for another one? Ironically, or maybe not so ironically, this happened to me when I was in Ukraine. And I was actually covering, I was still at CNN at the time, and I was covering the refugee flood out of Ukraine. And at that point, the Western media was being highly criticized for the way that it was being highly criticized for the levels of empathy that it was showing towards Ukrainians fleeing when they hadn't shown the same level of empathy towards Syrians, towards Afghans, towards any other conflict. And I remember standing at the Polish-Ukrainian border, and I was looking at these families that were coming out. And mostly women and children because men weren't being allowed to leave or they had chosen to stay behind. And this scene that I've seen so many times throughout my career, the mother who is dragging along her child who's so tired that their little legs are barely moving, and that rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat of a suitcase with all their life belongings in it being pulled across. And as I was looking at this, I recognized that I did not feel the same level of empathy that I had felt when I had seen that scene, when I was covering the refugee crisis that was happening across all of Europe. And I also remember when I was watching that scene that my brain somehow it created the screen, so I call it the screen, and it's this sort of hazy image that's on top of what I'm actually looking at that is of another scene entirely. So I was watching these Ukrainian families coming across and being welcomed and offered rides on buses, and there were piles of clothes and tea. And my brain superimposed the screen on top of it of a very similar scene from Syria, which was when the Syrian refugees were actually crossing into Hungary and being put into this massive pen in a field. And it was afterwards where I was kind of trying to unravel, why didn't I feel the same level of empathy for these Ukrainian families? Was it because, and somewhere in my mind, they were going to be more or less okay because they had that level of support? Was it something else? Was it something I needed to sort of, recognize and address within myself? And, it's not a comfortable position to put yourself in, but I needed to sort of unravel the why for myself. And I kind of ended up landing on this concept of, oh, it's not as bad as what I've seen before. And that is such a dangerous space to be in. Because our barometers for not as bad and what we accept now as being okay are so fundamentally skewed. And this, we need to recognize too, is a war tactic and is a political tactic. And I had to recognize that I had been manipulated unconsciously, and I had to sort of work through that to come to this conclusion. And there's this sort of spectrum. I forget what it's called right now, but you have the middle point, and then on either side you have two extremes. And what is deliberately done is you have the middle point and what should be accepted. And then you have the point of what is unthinkable, and then you have the point of what is unconscionable. And key players out there, whether it's military or politics or those who are working around other agendas, will work towards the unconscionable so that we become manipulated into accepting the unthinkable as being the norm. We can't recognize any of this unless we're attuned to our own and to the emotional history that is around us. We can't do any of this or be attuned to any of that unless we have empathy, no matter which front line it is that we are operating on. And as a final sentence, I want to just share one last thing. News only has value in the context of humanity. News, everything we do, only has value in the context of humanity. And that is still something that is worth fighting for. Thank you. I was keeping an eye on the clock because I think we did want to leave time for questions.
So if you have a question, just raise your hand.
Also, if I can just say, I also write my notes on paper and then I completely forget to use them. And I didn't think I was of the older generation, but thanks for pointing that out, David. Question?
Paulina, maybe you can take this.
Hey, I'm Paulina Grimm. I'm a WPI alumna from 2022. This is my fourth time in this conference. I'm really happy to be here. I got to meet you, Arwa, yesterday, and your presentation was very good. Thank you for that. When you catch yourself being less empathetic to somebody or some group, what do you do? What is your go-to? How do you talk to yourself? Do you have a pattern or like a strategy?
It can be a very awkward conversation. So this is where I'm lucky, right? So I live alone with my cats, and my inner monologue, I think, is hilarious, and I'm really good at talking to myself. All joking aside, that's actually a really good question because I haven't come to these conclusions because I'm like some sort of whatever. There's a lot that I still don't know, and there's a lot that I'm still trying to work out. I have come to sort of these conclusions in my current way of thinking and the guidelines that I've set for myself because of what I've lived and seen and witnessed, over the last 20-something years. And I always kind of repeat the question of why. Why did you feel less? If we go back to the Ukraine example, why did you feel less empathy for them? And then the other voice goes, well, maybe it was because of whatever. Okay, well, why did that whatever come to be? What framed you to think that? And why are you accepting this in yourself? And actually the conversation about, kind of mental health and being in the field, I think is super important. And we all have this tendency to want to be tough and portray this tough exterior to the outside, but also portray it to ourselves to a certain degree. Even when you go and you have your own private little breakdown in the bathroom, you kind of I'll still walk out and be a bit, not necessarily ashamed, but damn, Arwa, you should be better than this. And then I go into the same cycle though, right? Completely different conversation, but why? Why do I think I should be better than this? Why do I think it's bad to actually let out some emotion? Why am I too being subjected to this framework that is also a different kind of manipulation that is dictating to me that I have to constantly be strong and that I am not allowed to address my inner tornadoes? And what has actually worked for me really well over the years, so I used to, for being completely frank, I was your classic war correspondent, right? 2 packs of Marlboro Reds, bottle of whiskey, you name it. And then I outgrew that. Well, I mean, yeah, no, I did. And what worked really well for me was EMDR, which is kind of this technique that sort of, trauma injures your brain, which is an organ like any other, and can disalign the way that your left and right brain are working together. EMDR helps to realign that. That actually worked really well for me, and also very different kinds of breathing techniques, which is kind of a bit beyond what you were originally asking. But I think when I try to get to anything, I'm just asking the why. What framed your thinking? Why? And then you come up with like some really weird answers to yourself sometimes.
Arwa, thank you so much for your speech, and it made me think of a lot of things. Because during the beginning of the European refugee crisis, I actually quit journalism and I started doing humanitarian work. And then I burned out and I came back to journalism as if it was a more comfortable resort. I mean, at least here I know what I can do. And more than 10 years later, when I was listening to you and what you're doing, I was thinking, like, okay, journalism kind of gives us the resort that here we try to stay neutral and we try to show the facts, etc., etc. But actually, yeah, without the empathy and without really showing the context that we stay, I don't think that we can really stay neutral. And what do you think about it, about these inner struggles that actually, is it okay to admit that at some points we are activists?
So I actually believe that the notion that we are neutral is a farce, and I'm sorry. And I don't say that to take away from the industry. And I'm actually going to quote a former colleague of mine, Christiane Amanpour, who said, "Our job is not to be neutral. Our job is actually to be fair." And those are two very, very different things. I also don't believe that highlighting pain, that making people understand the consequences of actions and decisions that happen in the halls of power is somehow activism. I call it education. As long as, again, the context of everything is being properly explained. I also, and I used to get asked this a lot because when I started my charity, I was still at CNN, so I was still reporting in the field. You know, do you not think that this is a conflict of interests? For me, absolutely not. I don't believe that it is a conflict of interest if you are a journalist and you're watching someone die in front of you, a kid who's trapped underneath the rubble or whatever, and you put down the camera and you go help. Because I do believe that as journalists, there has been sort of this trajectory of being told that we need to be these cold, impartial people, which to me is absurd because we're human first. And secondly, if you've put your humanity to the side and you're going out to report on human interest stories without humanity, what level of a disrespect is that to people that are trusting you with their story? I mean, obviously, like that being said, like, so for example, when I was in the field with CNN, but then I already had my charity, Inara, like, there's certain lines you don't cross, right? You never say, hey, let me talk to your injured kid because I have a charity and I'm going to give you treatment, right? Like that. So I always had like a bit of a Chinese wall up between it. And so no, I don't think we become activists. I think we become better storytellers. I think we become better educators. The line that crosses into activism is so far away from anything that I believe I've ever done that I think I think it's actually part of what we need to do more of.
So I have been a journalist for 43 years. And I really feel for everything that you've shown to us and told us. I have worked in Palestine. I have worked with orphan kids, refugee children in Bulgaria. As you know, this is the external border of the European Union, and we welcome a lot of children from Syria and Afghanistan. So I know what it's like to see these children with their hoodies on, completely encapsulated. And once you approach one child, and then all of the children take their hoodies off because they want to be embraced as well. So we're talking about impact. We're talking about what journalists are supposed to tell, to show, and to convey. But it hurts me. And this is a question I want to pose to you. Don't you think that recently journalism has lost its teeth, so to say? It does show many stories. It does attempt at empathy, but somehow it fails to influence public opinion. It fails to influence politicians, and it fails to stop all of this.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I mean, first of all, yes, of course it hurts. And I'm sure you and a lot of us in this room, we carry this hurt with us, and everyone has an opinion as to how we're supposed to process it, or, what do you do to recharge or whatever. And I do believe that journalism is in a very dangerous crossroads right now. And I do believe that it is worth fighting for. And I do believe that we're not doing good enough. I refuse to be convinced that this is the best that we can do. I've been to Gaza 4 times since October 7th with my charity, Inada. So I left CNN 3 years ago. I went off to do this documentary, and then the Turkey-Syria earthquake happened, and then Gaza happened, and then I've kind of just been sucked into that world. And that story you tell about the children, how when you approach one, and they see this touch that we can have with them, and the others come. I don't know about you, but I've always incorporated those moments into my reporting, because it's how you show an outsider what the impact can have. It's how you alter their vision of what that child was being defined as. These labels that we have, such as, refugee, or my least favorite one is, internally displaced person, as if, they're like a lost piece of luggage. Our current, I think we need to look as an industry towards how we can begin to evolve the rhetoric that we use as our fallback descriptors of certain things, because the words that we do use tend to be quite dehumanizing to a certain degree, or at the very least, very easily discardable. 2 million refugees fled from Sudan. Nobody blinks. 2.2 million people don't have aid in Gaza. We say aid, but it makes it seem like they're just sitting around, waiting for something. It takes away from the weight of what it is that their experience actually is. And I think, it's part of our choice, and I believe it's part of our obligation. If we're going to choose to call ourselves journalists, if you're going to choose to call yourself a journalist, I think the moral code you need to live by has just significantly been increased. And I know, because I am too, everyone is exhausted, but the amount of your own energy you need to put into your work has to significantly increase too. I remember, so when Syria was happening, it was kind of at that stage where the Russians had already gotten involved and everyone was being pushed into Idlib province, and that was the only point that I could access because I had years earlier been blacklisted by the regime in Damascus. And the Russians and the Assad regime were still bombing Idlib. And everyone kept saying to me, you're making such a bad career move. Why do you keep going back into Syria? Nobody cares. None of the reporting is making a difference. Why do you go back? Why do you keep fighting for this story? And I was asking myself that too. Again, actually, why? Because I know it's not making a difference. How many times have we talked about the aftermath of the bombings, or, children bleeding out in hospitals, or, the horrible situations in these refugee camps? It actually wasn't making a difference. And then again, through asking the why, I landed on actually, I'm not going back to Syria to make a difference. I'm going so that the victors don't get to write the only version of history. And so sometimes when I find myself in these situations, I need to alter my thinking in terms of how I actually approach them.
Arwa, thank you for that really compelling talk. You just said something about, terminology and the words we use, and we are now literally in an era of doublespeak. And I know we throw around the term Orwellian a lot, but it does seem like when you have the world superpower calling, the aggressor, let's not go into it. We all know what we're talking about with doublespeak. And then I think about what I see as an overemphasis on fact-checking and disinformation. And nothing you said in your whole speech touched on the idea of fact. And I just wonder, to what extent do you think this effort to, focus on propaganda and disinformation, which have been around as long as journalism has been around, takes us away from the core point of journalism and redefines journalism, as you said, around the terminology, around what the victors and those in power want it to be? This idea that it has to be objective, that it has to be impartial or it's something else. It seems to me like this is part of the broader propaganda efforts to twist journalism and take away the humanity and the empathy that we need to tell the stories that will help us rewrite history.
I 100% agree. It's actually a fascinating, conversation to sort of have with a lot of different thoughts of people on it as well. Because the thing is, obviously, I have a deep, affliction towards the truth and facts. But there's certain things that we also need to recognize is that there's different levels of truth, which again is not a comfortable conversation that I think a lot of us like to have, because we want to, and we've been conditioned to firmly believe in a singular thing that's called the truth. But oftentimes, what we're subjected to is multiple different pieces of information that don't always come together to form this, neat tableau of what the truth actually is. So if you look at, an attack, literally like any attack anywhere in the world, what's the truth? Who carried it out? Yes, you'll get all of the outlets will, actually, let's be more specific. The attack that happened early on in Gaza, Israel, that happened outside of the Al-Auda hospital, 400 people said to have been killed. Was it Israel or was it Hamas? Literally, every single news organization that I'm aware of did their own independent investigation and came up with a different conclusion. So how do we even begin to look at that situation? What is the actual sort of, truth that you can get to in those situations? There's people who are dead. Is the only actual probable truth that we're going to know in all of that. And that doesn't just apply to that, singular scenario, which is why I keep talking about, the need for emotion to be involved, or at least emotional history and empathy, because we need to understand the emotions that generates, not just to understand the emotion in that specific moment, but to understand the trajectory that it could lead a person and or a population on. How did the Taliban take over Afghanistan? 1,000,001 different reasons, yes, but the biggest and easiest one that could have been avoided would have been the drone war that blew up a whole bunch of weddings and literally sent thousands of recruits running towards the Taliban. And the weird thing, so I was actually just in Afghanistan in January. And in the weird way that things change, because the Taliban is in control, I was actually hanging out with the Taliban. And it's very bizarre because everyone who would have wanted to kill you is now tasked with protecting you. But as such, we would have these conversations, which is very strange because obviously we don't share the same way of thinking. But I was talking to one of the Talibs that I was talking to. He's like probably in his early 20s. And when he was 15, he had joined the Taliban. Now, this isn't a kid from nowhere who wasn't educated. He actually was in school, dropped out of school, much to the horror of his parents. And he specifically joined because the US had carried out a strike that had killed a bunch of his relatives in his village. And that was his key motivator for then going up and wanting to join. Needless to say, now when he goes home, his sisters like yell at him all the time because they really want their education and their rights back. But the thing is you hear this over and over again, right? Like this one incident or a series of actions led to a certain individual making that decision. And the thing is, there's a couple of our emotions that are also super easy to manipulate, which I think we all need to be hypersensitive to. And the biggest among them is fear. So we see this in every single dehumanization campaign. We see this in political campaigns. It's fear. Fear the other. Fear those who don't think like you. Fear those who don't look like you. And that puts us into these little sections. And if we as journalists, I think, want to sort of break, again, that barrier that gets put down, we need to be willing to walk across it first. And again, it's very hard to walk across it and gain an understanding if you've, kind of parked your empathy and emotion at the door. And I also think that, like all other industries and like us as well, we're evolving. Journalism needs to evolve along with it. These sort of frameworks that we have of this is the truth, two sides to a story. We're so much more than that. And the truth also has multiple sides and perspectives on it.
My name is Emil Nikolov. I represent the Bulgarian National Radio. Indeed, we have to have empathy for those whose stories we tell. However, the facts and the general context are extremely important. I want to give a specific example from a year or two ago with the Russian TV station Dozhd. This is an opposition media outlet. After Russia's invasion, this media outlet was prohibited in Russia. It migrated to, I think, Latvia and continued broadcasting from there. One of the TV hosts took the liberty of saying, "Our guys," referring to the Russian soldiers preparing to fight in Ukraine. So he showed great empathy for them because they were also suffering. Their training was very poorly organized by the Russian authorities. Their living conditions were poor. The equipment was very poor. So this host was very empathetic for them. And this was not the first time he did that. For that reason, the Lithuanian authorities deprived this TV station of its license, and it was prohibited. It was banned in Lithuania. And this led to further polarization because a minority of journalists supported that TV host. The management of the TV station apologized and confronted that journalist. So I think it's very important to give the general context of suffering. What do you think the right approach is in such cases?
Having empathy and being empathetic in your reporting does not necessarily mean inserting yourself into it, right? So when the journalist says "our," that I think is the red flag. I think the point I'm trying to make is explaining the mindset of the Russian soldier, explaining their own lack of training, explaining perhaps their reluctance to even want to go to battle, or trying to understand what it is that has motivated them, if they are willing participants, is of great value. calling them our troops, no, this is where, as journalists, nothing is mine. No population is mine, and no country is mine. And I think that's sort of the division between, what this journalist did and the point that I'm trying to make. We saw this also in the lead up to the war in Iraq when, American journalists were standing on the back of, warships cheering American fighter jets going off to bomb Baghdad, as if on the other end of those bombs there weren't going to also be civilians. So I do find what this person did problematic. But I think the value of some pieces of information that he was trying to share with the audience are extremely important.
Arwa, thank you so much. One more round of applause for Arwa.
Thank you.